Hey folks, welcome to the Cute Woodland Creatures edition of my Precon reviews. A plurality of my patrons thought I should look at the group Hug Precon, and in this video I'm going to accomplish a simple set of tasks. I'm going to lay out what I think this deck is trying to do, I'm going to describe what I like about the deck, and finally I'm going to talk about what I dislike about it, and what changes I'd make to fix the things I dislike. With that in mind, let's jump right in. The commander for this deck is the Honorable Ms. Bumbleflower, and the first thing I note here is that her effect is quite cool and unique. Just the line, whenever you cast a spell, target opponent draws a card, is wild. Part of what lets me consider this a group hug commander of sorts is the sheer amount of value you can give to your opponents. There are general politics commanders like Brina and 2023 Rocco that passively offer opponents resources but have a built-in way to twist things back in your favor. But with Ms. Bumbleflower, you're actively handing your opponent cards when you cast spells, and if you don't cast exactly 2 spells per turn, she gives your opponents more cards than she gives you. The second spell clause gives you cards when the ability triggers for the second time each turn, and this really hones the blue identity of the card. You want to cast 2 spells per turn, unless you just love giving your opponents cards. In the deck list, we can see a number of things that fit in with what this commander is doing. For one, there are a fair number of decently chunky beaters, most of which would enjoy being given +1/+1 counters and flying. A lot of these utilize +1/+1 counters in some way, and to go with this, we can see a handful of other cards with some sort of counter synergies. In addition to the +1/+1 counter beats, there is some degree of giving other players resources present, as you might expect for a deck labeled Group Hug. There are 5 cards that utilize Bloomburrow's Gift mechanic, where a spell can have an additional effect if an opponent is offered some sort of resource. There are also 11 other cards I'd describe as huggy, and 6 cards that are vaguely political in some capacity, though the line between these two categories I've constructed is a bit fuzzy. There are also other cards whose effect depends on the actions of your opponents, and you could argue that these are political, though this deck is relatively beatdown oriented, so I'm not convinced it will be easy to talk opponents into feeding these. Results may vary, basically. It seems like this deck is looking to gradually develop beaters and value engines while currying favor with various opponents, right up until it starts to snowball out of control and can drop the friendly pretexts. So that's the deck. But what do I think about what this deck is doing? Well, I'll start with what I like, and there's actually quite a lot of that. This deck broadly has a decent card quality, a focused enough plan to win, and good amounts of different types of support cards. There are several quite decent quality beaters, and Ms. Bumbleflower is solid for purposes of amplifying and pushing through damage for both these and the cards that are more in the realm of support creatures. Side note, I find the aesthetic contrast between Psychosis Crawler and the rest of this deck very funny. The +1/+1 counter package of this deck, though not super wide, has some real all-stars in it. There are several different threats that grow over time, and among the handful of counter synergy pieces, Rishkar Pima Renegade is a pretty sweet ramp tool, and Colonian Hydra is a counter-pumping bomb that will run away with games if left unchecked. The deck will likely be able to politically navigate through the game using its commander, offering some opponents resources while beating down others with its suite of growing threats. As I mentioned earlier, the quantities of support cards here are also quite decent. There are 14 cards I'd categorize as ramp, and 15 cards I'd categorize as draw, and these should prepare the deck decently well to accelerate into a game plan and keep up momentum even if the deck hits some setbacks. I playtested this deck a decent number of times, and the average curve out that this deck manages is far better than in either of the other precons I've looked at. The deck is able to ramp, build resources with the commander, and set up value engines with quite a decent degree of consistency. Obviously, when I'm playtesting the deck, I'm kind of abstracting away the cards that opponents are being given, and I like to think that this is reasonable enough. A lot of EDH games will have 1 or 2 players who are lagging behind a bit for one reason or another, and while giving these players resources doesn't necessarily come at no cost, the gameplay cost will be lower than the cost of giving all opponents resources. For that reason, I mostly think about this resource donation as being probably not an issue as long as this deck is meaningfully progressing its own game plan at the same time. While you could reasonably argue that this means the deck should be held to a slightly higher bar than some other precons in terms of how it plays, it most likely passes even that bar as well. This is just a deck that plays pretty smoothly. A big part of this is likely the mana base. The mana base of this deck is pretty similar to the mana base of the Outlaws at Thunder Junction precon I looked at a few months back, which is to say, it has a healthy land count and a really robust amount of color fixing that results in quite healthy symbol counts. Now, this isn't at no cost. Of the 38 lands, 9 always enter tapped, and 7 sometimes do, and I'd guess that these two figures average out to a roughly 1/3 tap land quantity. While this is a bit higher than most players will want long term, it's far from a terrible starting point, and this tap land density doesn't feel particularly bad in practice. In addition, in the lens of considering this precon as a product, giving players more fixing lands to work with is undoubtedly a good thing, even if it means the deck includes tap lands that might later get cut. Finally, this deck has an adequate amount of ways to interact with things opponents are doing. This deck has 2 counterspells, 3 board wipes, 5 single-target removal spells, and a smattering of other cards that play related purposes such as slowing opponents, defending against major attacks, and protecting key pieces. Now, one of those categories I've been historically less of a fan of. I find that space dedicated to defensive spells would often be better allocated on actual removal, or on things that push a player's own game plan. And I will be cutting a couple defensive cards from this deck. Kind of. But this deck's plan of building large evasive threats means that life total races won't be an uncommon situation, and having a fog around in that case might be quite helpful. The deck's political tools, namely the commander, also give it a decent option for negotiating with opponents and avoiding pressure if it seems worth the price of an opponent having some cards. I can see the appeal of this deck's political and defensive elements, and I imagine they work decently in tandem with the deck's more concrete removal for keeping the game under control. Alright, it's time to get into what I dislike about this precon, and also what I'd change to help it out with those things. I mentioned that the mana base of the deck reminds me of the OTJ Gonti precon, and there's one other way that this precon reminds me of that one. In the video where I reviewed the Gonti deck, I highlighted that it feels like the deck list was designed to be a generic theft deck rather than a semi-theft deck tailored to what Gonti does. This precon is similar in that it seems like Wizards of the Coast added a bunch of group hug stuff to this precon because the commander does something vaguely group hug-y, but Ms. Bumbleflower is not a generic group hug commander. No, Snail's theory of optimal Bumbleflower dictates that I want to be sharing card draw with my weakest opponent, maybe playing politics with it here and there, and also making optimal usage of the +1/+1 counters and flying that Ms. Bumbleflower gives me. In addition, a lot of the group hug elements currently in the deck don't even feel like they play that nicely with the rest of what the deck is doing. Basically, what I dislike about this deck is that it's a bit unfocused, including lots of stuff that is outside what I believe the deck wants to be, a high-velocity, politics-heavy, +1/+1 counter beatdown deck. Now, I understand if somebody wants to play harder into the group hug elements, since group hug-ish precons don't come that often, but in my mind, there's just not enough to work with here for that. I will preserve the group hug element on some level though, in that I don't feel the need to prevent or take advantage of the cards that Ms. Bumbleflower gives my opponents. They're allowed to have a little gift. Another thing that might be nice is making the deck slightly lower curved to allow for double spelling with Ms. Bumbleflower earlier in the game, as the current deck is a bit high curved for my taste. Overall, I'm going to make 20 card swaps, and all of these will be done with a precon budget in mind. So I'm not going to add anything over $3, and I'm going to try to end up at a lower overall price for the deck. With that in mind, I'm going to start by cutting some of the huggier elements of this deck. I like the idea of extra land plays in the deck, but I don't really want my opponents to have extra land plays if they're going to be getting fed cards by me, so I choose to swap out Rites of Flourishing for Wayward Swordtooth, and Ghirapur Orrery for Case of the Locked Hothouse. Case is a really powerful card in general, and Swordtooth is a nice option as a creature to give flying once Ms. Bumbleflower is in play. I'm also choosing to cut Tenuous Truce and Intellectual Offering. These cards are doing something similar to what the commander is doing, but the rate on the cards per mana just isn't that great on either of these. Quain and Selvala likewise get cut because I like being able to choose which of my opponents get fed cards. If one of my opponents is ahead, I want to be able to avoid giving them extra resources while still being able to utilize my cards. Another type of card I choose to cut is cards that cost too much mana, since I'm trying to drop the mana curve. Octomancer is a funny card, but this isn't really a token deck, and 5 mana is just too much to pay for some vanilla stats. Another cut is Coveted Jewel, It's a funny card, but this deck doesn't have enough ways of preventing opponents from snagging it, and when it does get taken, they don't even need to pay that expensive 6 mana upfront like I did. Most other cuts I made were cards that just don't do enough. Bloodroot Apothecary, though it's pre-selling for upwards of $10, seems highly mediocre to me as anti-treasure tech. Opponents can still afford to crack a few treasures at a table without other poison, and then the rest can be saved for after the Apothecary is off the board. I'll take a Manglehorn over this any day of the week. Now, a cut that truly pains me is Jolly Gerbils. This card is extremely cute, but the deck simply doesn't have enough gift cards to justify its inclusion, and even if I added a few more, I'm still not convinced it'd be preferable to a better 2-drop. Another cut is Hoofprints of the Stag. This is a decent incremental value piece if it's played early, but it's a very dead draw later in the game. Triskaidekaphile is another card I opted to cut. This deck wants some number of no maximum hand size cards, but the deck already has several other ones, and this card just doesn't offer enough outside of that to warrant keeping it in my opinion. What goes in place of these cards? Beyond the replacements I already mentioned, a big area is +1/+1 counter synergies. A lot of these are reasonably basic. Conclave Mentor is a bear that amplifies counters. Dusk Legion Duelist is a bear that's a draw engine. Benthic Biomancer is a similar card for 1 mana that loots instead, and Kami of the Whispered Hopes is just a fantastic card, well worth the $2 or so price tag. A couple others I picked out that likewise offer a bit of ramp were Incubation Druid and Free Strider Lookout. Importantly, I tried to pick out stuff that's good in general and relatively low cost. The issue with picking out big, fancy payoff cards is that opponents can just deny your commander with removal, and then suddenly you invested heavily in something that can't actually materialize. Kami and Druid in particular are especially great because without the commander, they're still mana dorks, but with even a single targeting with Ms. Bumbleflower's ability, either of them can suddenly tap for 3 whole mana, and Kami only goes up from there. There are also a few more specific cards from Modern Horizons 3 that I added, as that was a fantastic set for +1/+1 counter synergies. Dreamtide Whale is a card that feels like it was made for this deck. It proliferates +1/+1 counters, it has a high power for delivering flying beats, and this is a deck that wants to double spell anyway, so the Whale should be sticking around. Evolution Witness is another pretty sweet card. It's not going to be wildly powerful in the early game, but later in the game it can be an unstoppable torrent of value. The third card from this set I added is Envoy of the Ancestors, and this is my answer to the question of defensive cards and life total races. Just gain some life. This card sets up a player for a truly impressive quantity of life gain, which will help when facing off against the final player and needing to survive long enough to get the necessary attacks in to finish them off. Beyond these, I also tweaked the interaction suite a bit. I added Negate as a nice general purpose counterspell to help with avoiding board wipes, and I also swapped out Perplexing Test for a slightly weirder 5 mana instant, Broker's Confluence. This is a fun package for the deck. It can shut off a problematic ability, it can protect our board without losing the counters, and it can also serve as a sort of overrun type card if we're going in for the kill. You can always just proliferate. Finally, I also tweaked the mana base to have more green mana, since I just cut a bunch of blue and white cards and added a bunch of green ones. Overall, this precon was quite solid, and I actually considered changing fewer than my usual 20 cards for this deck considering that. You could probably drop the number of changes to 10 and still have quite a decent +1/+1 counter-based upgraded precon, but I just felt like taking it all the way with my changes. I didn't talk about this earlier beyond gesturing the fact that a lot of tables will have a player or two lagging behind, but I imagine the sort of selective hug effect seen on Ms. Bumbleflower is likely an enjoyable addition for a lot of tables. My issue with Symmetrical Group Hug is that though it means everybody's deck gets to do something, it often also means that the player who is getting ahead anyway gets to have even more advantage. This more selective method of resource giving, on the other hand, can theoretically lead to more dynamic games, with different players on a more equal footing. To anybody who has played with this precon or this commander in general, let me know if this was your experience, because I'm kind of curious. Thanks for watching. If you like what I do here and you want some more of it, you can support me over on Patreon. I recently got a new camera lens, and I've started recording these kind of random face cam videos of ideas that I've had but that haven't quite made their way into a video, and I'm posting those over on Patreon. One that I released a day or so ago included some thoughts on a bunch of different Bloomburrow cards. If that sounds up your alley, link is going to be down in the description.